Welcome to the chair. I'm your host, Dr. Digby James Wren. Cannibalisation of allies and partners, and China and its stabilising role in the world economy. In the period from 1945, specifically up to, we'll talk about 2001 and the War on Terror. So post-World War II, the US dominates global manufacturing. 50% of total output in the world is US. So they dominate by far. They have the most powerful military, the most powerful navy, the most powerful industrial complex, but it all starts going downhill almost immediately. And then there was the Communist Revolution, 1949 in China, and then you had the imposition of a bamboo curtain. And the idea, of course, was that they would constrain China and they would weaken China and they would eventually try to subjugate China. The Americans, of course, reneged on their Cairo declaration and decided that they were not going to return Taiwan directly to the Chinese. And so only 5 powers signed that agreement. Australia, the UK, France, the Netherlands, and the US. But India refused to go, saying that they were not going to sign up to this idea. It was colonialism and imperialism again, and they were not going to sign a document that the imposition of American empire on Taiwan. During that period, the Japanese economy received enormous inflows of money from the Department of Defense in the United States to rebuild their economy as well, so that they could actually function as the forward base for the invasion of the Korean Peninsula. And it was only later that the UN was kind of pushed across the line to send some nominal forces from the UK, France, the Netherlands, and Australia. So the same powers. So that's the 50s. Japan is now getting expanded economy because it's sort of the industrial output to help this war effort. There was a small interim there, by the way, for Suez, which is important because that was really the end of French and UK power in the Middle East, and that was a struggle over energy. The reason they wanted to control Suez was to control the supply of energy, and you can see that that has been repeated in the Ukraine and Russian energy. It's the same story, and they've lost again. And in both cases, the Americans pulled out at the end. So the EU should have wised up to that one almost immediately, and it clearly shows that political elites in the EU don't know their history. The reindustrialization of Korea, Vietnam War. Over 250,000 Koreans served in Vietnam during the Korean War. That's a very big number. And so that reindustrialized Korea, and also to offset growing Chinese power and influence. That didn't turn out so well either, although it did destabilize the peninsula, the Southeast Asian peninsula, Vietnam, and Cambodia, and Laos, and Thailand, and Myanmar. And Malaysia, there was also activities, British and Australian forces were fighting also in Malaysia, and in Indonesia, where there was a massacre of Chinese and anybody that was a communist or perceived to be a communist. And that didn't turn out well either, but it did reindustrialize South Korea. So now we need to go just forward a little bit more, and then we're in the 70s. Suddenly, the Germans and the Japanese, Korea got strong economies. And so what did Nixon do to stop that? Depegging the dollar from gold. Because the reserves of gold, those countries had just used their trade surpluses with the US to start purchasing gold, to restabilize their own currencies. And the US didn't like this at all. And it knew that if anybody drew down on the dollars and asked for them to be changed to gold, the US would not be able to do it. So they had to depeg, and they did. And so that put them in the situation of what's called exorbitant privilege. But then that led to other problems. So to offset their problem, what they said was, okay, we'll invest our surpluses into the US economy. And that's what they started to do. But then the Americans became hooked on Mercedes and Toyotas and so forth and so on. And so that created another problem. And so 1987, fast forward, 17 years later or 16 years later, the Plaza Accords. This is where the cannibalization really starts to happen. So by now, the thing is, by restricting the access to the US market, imposing restrictions on currency, tariffs, and so forth, they're able to subjugate those economies to the US economy and the power of the dollar. This is where the US makes most of its money, is in services, not in manufacturing. They let that go because there's much more money in services. Fast forward again to 1997, and the East Asian tigers have all grown now. But their power is also coming from surpluses made in the US market. So imports. And to keep this alive, the US starts to borrowing from the Germans, it's borrowing from the Japanese, and it's borrowing from anybody they can, the UK, everybody. And so that's all very good and well. For the moment, everybody's keen, everybody thinks it's all going to work out, the US economy is growing. But then let's fast forward a little bit to 1997, and the Japanese are now in real trouble. 10 years of stagnation is really crippling their economy, and so they start calling in their loans to all of the East Asian tigers and their ASEAN partners. What happens? They collapse the growth that's happening in Southeast Asia. Those countries go into some kind of a stagnation as well, but it's China that helps them out. Now, this means that China is now on the rise in real terms, and they've got some money available, surplus capital to invest, and they do. And by 2001, they're getting into the WTO, and then their economy just starts taking off. And so at the same time, the US is now embroiled in the war on terror. And this is going to cost them trillions. Afghanistan was the Central Asian crossroads for trade. And so by dominating Afghanistan, they were able to constrain China in the West. And this, of course, has meant that now it's been constrained in the East by Taiwan, Japan, and Korea, and the Philippines. And now it's also being constrained in Afghanistan and in the Middle East and Iran. That is costing trillions and trillions of dollars. And then there's Iraq. They're losing money hand over fist. And at this point, they're not able to start imposing conditions on China and China's rapid growth. In fact, they're becoming dependent on that. Giovanni Arrighi talked about this. The US was now becoming subject to debt to Japan and China and Germany. You get to the Trump era, it's all about that, isn't it? We can't continue to be, to borrow money to buy imports from our allies and partners. So the cannibalisation is now being accelerated. All of these new tariffs, all of these new sanctions are all about cannibalising those allies' economies to suck money back into the US to rebuild their industrial base. But there's a false assumption here, because it's no longer the world's largest economy in PPP terms, and it's not the manufacturing hub, and it's not the largest consumer market anymore. 32 million cars were made in China last year. Only 16 million were made in America. So that's double, and that's going to increase. And now China is dominating the automotive industry, but they are not reliant on exports to the United States. So how are they going to impose Plaza Accords to China? And so the US is now run into this real problem where it has to cannibalize its allies, and can only cannibalize its allies. And by shutting them off from Russian energy, they've managed to do that. And remember Suez? That's what's happened in Ukraine. Now they've cut them off from energy from Russia. They're now dependent on US energy, and the US is cannibalizing their capital and their industrial output, trying to move it to America. But the false assumption is that the Americans are going to be able to export or create a surplus for export, because their technology is not the best any longer. It's Chinese technology which is the best. It's EVs, it's batteries. And then we talk about semiconductors. And even doing that is not working. We can clearly see with Huawei that Huawei is far ahead in 5G technology, backbone of all 5G in the world. Some countries are trying to strip it out, but this is not about security, actually. There is no evidence that Huawei has committed any breaches of national security in any country. There is only accusation and excuses, and this is related to commercial domination of that market. In technological terms, US technology in communications is no longer primary. Clearly, 5G and 6G China is in the lead. EV and renewables, China is in the lead. This is huge investments in education, science, technology, manufacturing, supply chains, guaranteeing commodity to brand supply chains. Now, it's true that China is not yet really strong in brands, other than, say, Huawei, Xiaomi, BYD, but that's developing. But they're going to be there very, very soon. And the high streets of every street in the country, every street in the world, is going to have brands, just like they've got Japanese brands and German brands and American brands, Italian brands, Spanish brands. There will be Chinese brands everywhere. This is an inevitability. If you are the largest manufacturer, the largest trader in the world, this is clearly going to happen. And all of these sanctions designed to constrain China have only catalyzed further advances. And because China has the largest by far team of most educated scientific teams in the world, they are able to break all of these sanctions. And I think you'll find that Huawei is very soon going to have lithography machines to be able to develop 3 nanometer, 2 nanometer, and start coming up with even different kinds of advances in quantum and so forth. And AI, DeepSeek, Manus, you can see what that's done. Took $1 trillion off the US stock market with DeepSeek. So it's clear that this is not going to work either. And the Belt and Road and all of China's trading partners in the global south and Russia, with its backbone of energy and commodities, is clearly now stronger. So the BRICS, for example, is now stronger in market terms, in population size, in mineral wealth, and clearly they are going to work together and stay working together. And Trump's idea to weaken that and break that and not let anybody go off the dollar is in real terms related to not just the dollar, but those services that I talked about earlier, and those services that are provided by virtual or real monopolies: Google, Amazon, Microsoft, Nvidia, etc. And they're cannibalizing the Netherlands ASML, they're cannibalizing TSMC, they're getting Toyota to reinvest back into America with what? Old vehicles, old technology. And the same is true for Germany and the Europeans. What choices do they have? And so this cannibalization weakens the alliance structure. And now you're going to see that Europe is going to have to very carefully reconsider trading, opening up investment and trade with China and with Asia. Now, they've been skirting around this. There's teams of people from the EU and the UK going around ASEAN countries all the time, trying to sign deals, trying to get things in place. But it won't be enough. It's not going to happen, and neither is the US, because the stagnation that's been in the Japanese economy, the German economy, and other economies that are allied to the US is now come back to bite the US. And the Atlanta Fed has said the US is going to go into second quarter 2.8% contraction, and they're going into stagnation. Only 2 countries in the world have complete supply chains, and only 1 country in the world is the world's largest manufacturer and exporter, and has not exercised and wasted all its money on warfare. It's used all its money to invest in infrastructure and innovation at speed and scale, and that's China. And then we talk about China and stabilization. This is the contemporary role of China, and one just has to think about yin and yang, and what we all know as the black and white diagram. So harmony. And this is a deep philosophical approach for Chinese foreign policy and all policies, really, and their approach, and that is there must always be an opposition. That exists, and it can never not exist. It will always exist, and one has to always take that into consideration. The idea is not to crush your opposition. The idea is to be adaptive and flexible, realizing that there will always be an opposition. One just needs to try and balance it. The idea is not to totally dominate completely, because there will always be an opposition. You'll end up fighting everybody again over and over. What is the point? What you want is long-term stability. And that is what China's foreign policy is all about. And they're very, very patient. And if you don't think they're patient, just look at Taiwan. But what they have demonstrated is that they are able to set a security umbrella around Taiwan that already exists, and into the South China Sea that already exists. So what is happening? The response from the Americans: missiles. Put the missiles all around the first island chain. This is why Australia is, the AUKUS thing is active. It's not about surveillance. It's about being able to get up to the continental shelf in submarines, in secret, and launch missiles. In this point of time, China is the mediating power, the deterrent power, and the US is the assertive and even belligerent power. And as I've said in other videos, prior videos last week, we now have fragmentation, 2 sets of fragmentation going on with the Americans. And the first one is a line that runs straight from the Ukraine down to Gaza. That's a straight line. Just look at a map. And then the second one is in ASEAN, which is the Philippines, a maritime power, and the second one was to try and destabilize Myanmar, a continental power, which would destabilize the border with China, and also ASEAN. So, trying to make ASEAN unworkable as a bloc, just as the Americans have been able to do with the EU. They destabilized the EU, and the first big sign was Brexit. This was backed by the US. Trump himself was there saying, yes, do it, do it, do it. And at this point, you could see that the EU was going to be in serious trouble. And then the idea that they were going to go to war and support the Ukraine against Russia was a fool's errand and should never have happened. And Trump himself has said so. And so this is the situation we're in today. China is now the stabilizing power in the world, and it's done it without spending money on wars. This is really a key point for everybody to understand. And I think we're going to see more and more the Japanese and the Koreans being softly with China. And ASEAN is definitely going to benefit. There's no doubt about it. That's already the world's biggest trading partnership. And I think we're going to see the EU suddenly wake up once their political elites like von der Leyen and Kallas and the small Baltic states lose this kind of balancing power that they've been exercising, in the fear of Russia, and supported by, really in-depth support from the UK, and not so much really from France, although France, Macron, he's a lame duck, and he has a big chip on his shoulder about the Americans, has a big chip on his shoulder about the submarines in Australia, and he has a big chip on his shoulder about losing all of his influence in Africa, access to gold and minerals and so forth. So you can see that the EU has been fragmented and destabilized. The Americans would love to be able to achieve the same result in ASEAN, but I think it's not possible. And Cambodia and Thailand and Malaysia are actively working to stabilize Myanmar, and that's a good thing. And they've been very active immediately for the most recent earthquake. And so just to sum up and end this, China's role in the world gains incrementally every time the Americans try to further impose constraints on their economy and further cannibalize the economies of their allies to maintain their present level of power and to maintain their services, because that's where they make their money. And I think that also is a losing argument. Whether or not it'll happen under the leadership of Donald Trump, I'm not sure. I can't say that cycle is going to be that short, but I do know that the most important thing that Donald Trump can do is to ensure the position of his successor, that there's going to be somebody, a follower, MAGA follower, go become president for 4 years or 8 years after him. This has got to be his number one primary goal after he's achieved what he thinks he's doing now with tariffs and sanctions, and stripping all the assets out of his allies to rebuild the American economy. And so it's going to possibly have a short-term effect. Spending on military, of course, is always going to help that, and so there's another reason for a focus on military. And you can see the Europeans are trying to do that as well now. They've refloated the idea of strategic autonomy, which was taken away from them after Brexit. It's a losing game. The only way to go here is to look at BRICS, to look at the global south, and to actively start trading with them in an open fashion, open with China, and joint ventures, working together, collaboration, understanding that China is a peaceful power, has risen peacefully, and it thinks about the world in harmonious ways. It does not think about it in the way of singularities and domination. It does not think like that. And the sooner the Europeans and the wake up to that, and the sooner that Donald Trump realizes that these policies are going to go nowhere, it's not going to work, not in the medium term, perhaps in the short term, but not in the medium term. But we're stuck with it right now. So I hope you've enjoyed this short talk about Donald Trump, about US policy, about cannibalisation, about China, and we'll be meeting each other again very soon. Thank you.